In August 1945, a Soviet children's choir handed the United States ambassador in Moscow a hand-carved wooden Great Seal. He hung it on the wall behind his desk. For the next 7 years, every word he spoke in that room was secretly transmitted across the street. The bug had no batteries, no transistors, no power source of any kind. It was invisible to every counter-surveillance sweep. Across 4 ambassadors, it recorded 30,000 hours of classified atomic policy briefings, Marshall Plan negotiations, and Korean War coordination. Penetrated, in plain sight, by a passive cavity smaller than a thumb. It is the first passive listening device ever deployed. The Americans called it the Thing. This is File 17, the Great Seal Bug. The summer of 1945 was a moment of extraordinary diplomatic flux. The Yalta agreements were a few months old. The Potsdam Conference had just ended. Roosevelt had been dead for less than 4 months. Truman was barely into his presidency. The atomic bomb had been used at Hiroshima 3 days before the gift ceremony at the Spaso House. The new United States ambassador to the Soviet Union was Averell Harriman. A banker, a railroad heir, a confidant of Roosevelt. And now the principal channel between the new Truman administration and Stalin's government. Every word Harriman spoke in his Moscow study was, in 1945, among the most strategically valuable signals on Earth. The Soviet response to that fact was not to wiretap the building. The Spaso House was swept regularly for wiretaps by the U.S. Army's Signal Corps. Any wired listening device would have been detected within weeks. Any battery-powered listening device would have eventually run out of power and stopped working. The Soviet response was to deliver, as a gift, a hand-carved wooden plaque. Inside the plaque, hidden by a thin veneer of Karelian pine, sat a passive, resonant cavity microphone. Designed by Léon Theremin, the Russian inventor of electronic music, who had been working in an NKVD prison research bureau for the previous 7 years on exactly this kind of hardware. The cavity needed no batteries. It produced no emissions when not being illuminated. It was, electrically, a piece of brass with an antenna wire across its back. To any Western counterintelligence sweep of the era, it would have appeared completely passive because it was. The plaque was presented during a goodwill ceremony by a Soviet children's choir on August 4, 1945. It was hung on the wall of Harriman's private study by his own staff that same afternoon. Within hours, a Soviet operator in an unmarked van across the street was illuminating the seal with a 330 megahertz radio beam and recording the demodulated reflection. For the next 7 years, every conversation Harriman held in that study was Soviet intelligence product. The genius of Therimin's design was that the bug had no electronics in any conventional sense. A normal listening device requires a microphone, an amplifier, and a transmitter. The microphone converts sound into an electrical signal. The amplifier boosts that signal to broadcastable strength. The transmitter encodes the boosted signal onto a radio carrier wave and sends it to a receiver. All 3 of those components require electrical power. All 3 of those components emit detectable electromagnetic signatures even when transmitting nothing. A standard listening device sitting in a U.S. ambassador's study would have been found by any competent counterintelligence sweep within weeks. Battery-powered devices would eventually die. Mains-powered devices would be traced to a wire that did not belong. RF-emitting devices would show up on a Yagi antenna sweep. Theremin built a device that had none of those problems. His design was a hollow brass cavity, sized so that its resonant electromagnetic frequency was exactly 330 megahertz. One face of the cavity was a thin metal diaphragm, so thin it flexed visibly when sound waves struck it. The opposite face had a single thin antenna wire soldered to it. When the cavity was illuminated by an external 330 MHz radio beam, the cavity's resonance carried the beam's reflection back toward the source with the cavity's signature embedded. As sound waves in the room struck the diaphragm flexed by microscopic amounts. Those flexes changed the cavity's internal volume by microscopic amounts. Those volume changes shifted the cavity's resonant frequency by microscopic amounts. The reflected beam, returning to the Soviet van, carried a frequency modulation that perfectly mirrored the sound waves in the ambassador's study. The Soviets demodulated the reflected beam in their van. They recorded the demodulated audio onto magnetic wire. They transcribed the audio in NKVD analytical sections. The intelligence product flowed directly to Stalin. The bug needed no batteries. It produced no detectable emissions when the Soviet beam was not active. It was, electrically, a piece of brass with an antenna wire, completely indistinguishable from a piece of decorative metal trim. For 7 years, the Soviets parked their van across the street from the Spaso House and listened to the United States ambassador. For 7 years, the bug worked. Harriman left Moscow in 1946. He was succeeded by Walter Bedell Smith. Bedell Smith was succeeded by Alan Kirk. Kirk was succeeded by George Kennan in 1952. Each ambassador used the same study. Each ambassador sat at the same desk. Each ambassador conducted ambassador-level conversations beneath the same wooden seal hanging on the same wall. The seal had been hung in 1945. The Soviets had designed the bug for indefinite operation precisely because they did not know how long any one American ambassador would serve. The cavity was passive. It needed no maintenance. It would still work 50 years later if the building stood that long. For 7 years, the Soviet panel van across the street parked in shifts. NKVD operators rotated. Magnetic wire recordings flowed back to NKVD analytical sections. Russian language transcribers transcribed the audio. Senior analysts summarized the daily product. Stalin received briefings sourced directly from Spaso House conversations. By 1952, the bug had recorded approximately 30,000 hours of ambassador-level U.S. conversation. Atomic policy briefings. Marshall Plan execution details. Korean War coordination. NATO positioning. The long telegram itself, Kennan's foundational document of U.S. Cold War containment doctrine, was drafted in part beneath the wooden seal. The Soviets read it as he wrote it. And during all of those 7 years, the United States Army Signal Corps swept the Spaso House for listening devices on a regular schedule. They found nothing. They found nothing because Theremin's cavity had no electronics. They found nothing because the Soviet beam was not always active. They found nothing because the bug they were looking for did not match any pattern they understood. Inside the State Department, by 1952, officials had begun to notice that the Soviets seemed to anticipate every American diplomatic move out of Moscow. There was no obvious source. There was no obvious leak. There was, as far as the Signal Corps could determine, no listening device anywhere in the building. And then, in the late summer of 1952, a British radio operator on a routine countermeasures sweep noticed something that the Americans had missed for 7 years. The discovery happened on a routine British countersurveillance sweep in late September of 1952. A British radio operator was moving through the rooms of the Spaso House with a portable scanning receiver. The sweep was procedural. The Americans had been complacent about countersurveillance because their own sweeps had found nothing for 7 years. The British operator was using a different frequency band than the standard U.S. Signal Corps protocol. And his receiver, swept at 330 megahertz, picked up an anomalous reflected signal from inside Ambassador Kennan's study. He traced the reflection to the wall behind Kennan's desk. The reflection was coming from the wooden Great Seal of the United States. The seal had no electronics inside it that any X-ray equipment of the era had ever found. But under a 330 megahertz illumination from outside the building, the seal was reflecting a signal back to whatever was illuminating it. The British operator gestured to his American counterpart. They lifted the seal off the wall. They took it to a U.S. Army Signal Corps lab in central Moscow. They dismantled it. Inside the wood, hidden under a thin Karelian pine veneer, sat Léon Theremin's brass cavity. The thin metal diaphragm, the antenna wire. No batteries, no transistors, no electronics in any conventional sense. The most sophisticated covert listening device the United States intelligence community had ever encountered. The discovery was immediately classified. The Spaso House was swept again, much more thoroughly. Additional passive cavities, variations on the Theremin design, were found in other artifacts throughout the residence. For 8 years afterward, the United States kept the discovery secret. The Eisenhower administration did not want to reveal that an unsophisticated wooden gift had compromised 4 ambassadors over 7 years. And then, in May of 1960, 2 weeks after Soviet air defenses shot down the American U-2 spy plane piloted by Francis Gary Powers, the Eisenhower administration faced a Soviet propaganda campaign at the United Nations, accusing the United States of espionage. The American counterstrike was Henry Cabot Lodge, the United States ambassador to the United Nations, standing at the podium of the General Assembly with the wooden seal in his hands. He turned it around. He held the back up to the cameras. He pointed at the brass cavity. He described in plain English what it was and how long it had operated inside an American ambassador's study. The thing went on display at the National Cryptologic Museum at Fort Meade. It is still there today, behind glass, with a small brass plaque describing what it is. Visitors stand in front of the case and stare at a thumb-sized brass cylinder and a thin antenna wire, and try to imagine how something this small had penetrated the most heavily protected American building in Moscow for 7 years, before anyone in the United States Army Signal Corps had ever heard of a passive resonant cavity. And every covert listening device built since, every passive resonator, every parasitic cavity, every device without power tucked inside hardware delivered as a gift, has been a direct descendant of the brass cylinder Léon Theremin built in an NKVD prison research bureau in 1944. The thing proved a new theorem of intelligence operations that has only become more dangerous in the 80 years since. A listening device does not need to contain electronics. A listening device does not need a power source. A listening device does not need to emit anything detectable when it is not being illuminated. A listening device only needs to behave in the presence of an external radio beam as a parasitic resonator that modulates the beam's reflection with the sound waves of the room around it. Any object of the right shape, with the right materials, in the right place, can be that device. The technique has matured continuously since 1945. Modern parasitic RF implants are smaller than a fingernail. They can be embedded in wallpaper, in picture frames, in the plastic housings of consumer electronics, in the wood of office furniture. They can hide inside commercial products that arrive in a buyer's home through ordinary supply chain channels. They can be activated by RF beams projected from a vehicle parked across the street, from a drone overhead, or from a satellite in low Earth orbit. In 2013, a Bloomberg investigation alleged that Chinese intelligence operatives had embedded rice grain-sized hardware implants on Supermicro server motherboards, bound for 30 United States technology companies, including Apple and Amazon. The implants, the report claimed, were silent passive components soldered into legitimate motherboards during the manufacturing process at sub-tier supply chain factories. The implants required no power source of their own. They drew parasitic current from the server's existing power rails. They could exfiltrate data without raising any conventional intrusion detection alarm. Apple and Amazon both denied the report categorically. The denials by themselves do not resolve the underlying technical reality. The technique works. In 2020, the Lithuanian National Cybersecurity Center published a public advisory, warning that certain Chinese-manufactured smartphones contained pre-installed firmware capable of receiving remote activation commands. recording ambient audio and transmitting the recorded audio to overseas servers. When the phone was placed within range of a particular RF beacon, the Lithuanian Center recommended that Lithuanian government officials throw their phones away. Several did. In 2023, security researchers at the University of California demonstrated that ordinary off-the-shelf smart bulbs sold by major consumer brands could be remotely instructed to act as parasitic receivers, picking up the speech vibrations transmitted through the metal of the bulb's housing and transmitting recordings back across the consumer's own home Wi-Fi network. The bulbs needed no modification. The capability had been built into their firmware all along. The Theremin cavity has not died. It has only become smaller, cheaper, and more numerous. The session is logged. The connection is closed. The files remain open. Every gift you have received in the last decade, every smart device you have purchased, every piece of hardware that arrived in your home through a supply chain you did not personally inspect. Each of those objects is, technically, capable of behaving like a passive cavity, if the right illumination beam is aimed at the right corner of your house. Which leaves us with the closing question of File 17. Which gift hanging on your wall right now do you trust the least to not be the next wooden Great Seal, silently modulating an external radio beam with every word you have spoken in the room around it?